Last time we spoke about the Battle of the Drore River. In July and August, American and Japanese forces clashed near Afua in New Guinea. Troop A of the 112th Cavalry engaged Japanese units, pushing them back temporarily. Troop C replaced Troop A, but was soon isolated by Japanese attacks. The American TED Force, including the 124th and the 169th Infantry, launched a counteroffensive facing heavy resistance. Despite supply and terrain challenges, TED Force advanced, forcing the Japanese to gradually withdraw. By early August, the Japanese launched fierce and desperate attacks, but American defenses held firm. TED Force continued its advance, encountering further Japanese resistance, but successfully disrupted their supply lines. The Japanese, suffering heavy losses, were finally forced to begin a general retreat, as the American forces consolidated their positions by early August. It seemed Green Hell was living up to its dreadful nickname. This episode is Operation Dan. Welcome back to the Pacific War Podcast week by week, and I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about World War II? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on World War II, and so much more, so go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, found at YouTube and all major podcast platforms. Over on the YouTube channel, you can find a log documentary on the Japanese invasion of Manchuria. And on the podcast platforms, I'm releasing a new series on the North African campaign during World War II. Also, please, if you have a chance, check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel, where for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what we'll tackle next. This week we are picking up with the action along the CBI Theater. In Yunnan Province, by the end of July, General Wei's Y Force was still engaged in efforts to eliminate the resilient but small Japanese garrisons at Tong Chong, Matsuyama, Pingda, and Long Ling. Simultaneously, the 33rd Army was striving to accelerate preparations for Operation Dan, anticipating resistance from General Honda's main garrisons until September's end. Following the fall of Myitkyina in August, Honda recognized the need to expedite his offensive plans, despite delays in the deployment of the 2nd and 18th Divisions. Additional reinforcements from the 49th Division were expected in Mandalay by September, bolstering Honda's position. Meanwhile, General Matsuyama faced the challenge of isolated garrisons being cut off from his 56th Division, surrounded by superior enemy forces. With his main force focused on the imminent offensive preparations, Matsuyama could only provide moral support through radio messages. Colonel Matsue's recent successes reduced Chinese activity on the Manchu front, allowing for the recovery of the 113th Regiment by August, despite occasional small-scale raids. At Tong Chong, Colonel Kurashige resolved to defend the walled city to the last man against relentless infantry assaults, aerial bombardments, and continuous artillery preparations. Compared with the defenses of Lamang, the positions at Tong Chong were much less effective due to the factors of disadvantageous terrain and the lack of time to make defensive preparations. Tong Chong Castle covered an area slightly over half a mile square, and was surrounded by a rampart 16 to 20 feet in height and over 6 feet thick at the top. Although the rampart had a stone facing and was backed with clay, it was not proof against artillery bombardment, and considerable work was required to strengthen it. Concrete or stone pillboxes were constructed adjacent to all the gates and on 4 of the corners. Shelters were built to protect guns and machine guns mounted on ramparts, as well as the troops and supplies inside the wall. Other entrenchments were prepared within the castle itself. While these measures greatly strengthened the defenses, the castle was still not proof against an intensive aerial or artillery bombardment. Recognizing the southeast as the primary avenue of approach, General Ho directed his forces to concentrate their main efforts in that direction. On August 2nd, following another bombing raid by 12 B-25s that created a gap 15 feet wide, the 36th and 116th Divisions initiated a new general assault. The Japanese quickly worked to repair the breach, and they fired machine guns to cover it. It was only after concentrating guns, rockets, and flamethrowers on the southwest pillbox, along with 5 waves of fighter cover fire, that the Chinese were finally able to position scaling ladders against the wall. 2 companies then seized the top of the wall just east of the southern corner on August 3rd. Overnight, Kurashige led a successful counterattack that restored defenses along the rampart, except for one platoon that held its ground all night. This platoon's resilience allowed the Chinese reinforcements to pass through the breach on August 4th and seize a pillbox within the city. With the walls breached, the fall of Tong Chong became inevitable, but the determined defenders continued to resist fiercely over the coming days, inflicting heavy casualties on the Chinese attackers. Meanwhile, Major Kanemitsu's garrison was defending Maltsong fiercely. After the Hondo position had fallen, the 308th Regiment resumed the advance on August 3rd with flamethrowers that they were using to devastating effect to take the crest of Konglao-po. There, the Chinese found several Japanese tankettes, which had been dug in for the use as pillboxes. Despite repelling enemy attacks with great effort, the Japanese faced dangerously low ammunition supplies. As a result, Kanemitsu decided to raid the 8th Army's artillery positions and supply dumps to replenish his own ammunition stocks. 29 men selected from the artillery battalion were divided into 2 teams for the purpose. One team was to raid the artillery positions at Shirakabe and at Haraguchi Hills, as well as attack motor vehicles on the road between Lamang and Hutong Bridge. The second team was to operate in the area south and west of the Gake and Hondo positions. On the night of August 9th, 7 groups of Japanese volunteers launched a surprise attack, destroying several howitzers and seizing light weapons and ammunition. Despite Kanemitsu's initial success and his troops' resilient defense against Chinese infantry assaults, General Song opted to revert to conventional siege tactics starting on August 11th. His divisions began digging tunnels between key Japanese strongholds in the Maltsong Triangle, each tunnel stretching 22 feet to accommodate 2 powerful mines aimed at enemy pillboxes. One mine held 2,500 pounds of TNT, and the other mine held about 3,500 pounds. The mines were detonated on August 20th, causing significant damage that engineers exploited swiftly with flamethrowers, capturing Kanemitsu's primary stronghold. In one pillbox, 42 Japanese were buried alive, of whom 5 were rescued. The prisoners stated that they had been asleep and had never suspected that they were being undermined. At 9:20 a.m., the 3rd Regiment against light opposition took a few strong points that remained on the Songshan proper. In spite of particularly heavy pressure being exerted against the Sukuyama position, the enemy had made little progress. However, on the 19th, following a heavy bombardment, 3 tremendous blasts shook the Sukuyama position. The Chinese, becoming discouraged with trying to storm the position, had tunneled under it. The defenders of the Sukuyama position were virtually annihilated, and the position fell to the enemy. On the 23rd of August, the Lamang garrison regrouped to make a final resistance in the Otobayama, Nishiyama, Matsuyama, Yokomata, and Uyama positions. The total number available for defense had been reduced to just 150 men, all of whom were wounded, some quite seriously. Even those who had lost an arm or a leg were propped up into positions where they could fire a rifle or sight a gun. The Lamang garrison continued to resist in scattered pockets, launching futile counterattacks. Song recognized the battle's turning point. Talk about the Japanese Alamo, huh? During the later part of July and early August, the Yunnan force made new troop dispositions and moved 3 divisions in to attack the town. The main force of the Chinese, the 87th Division, was on the east front, with an element along the Tianmian Road. The new 28th Division was between the 2 elements of the 87th. Elements of the 1st Honor Division were on the north front, with the new 39th Division on the south and west front of Long Ling. At dawn on August 14th, preceded by an intense concentration of artillery fire and aerial bombardment, the Chinese forces launched a coordinated attack from all sides. Hill 6 bore the brunt of these enemy attacks for over 8 hours, but managed to hold, as did the defenders on the main line of resistance. After the attack had ceased, the garrison spent the entire night rebuilding defenses, using rubble and half-burnt materials from the town. However, 5 days later, Chinese forces captured the eastern hills, weakening the entire Japanese defensive line. Consequently, by August 23rd, the Eastern Front had collapsed, compelling the Japanese to retreat from their main defensive positions to reserve positions within the town. Matsuyama was aware that under the current conditions, Long Ling would likely fall before September began. While the timely reinforcement of the 3rd Battalion 148th Regiment would soon enable the garrison to hold out for a few more days, he understood the urgency of accelerating the Dan offensive to relieve Long Ling. Starting on August 26th, the 2nd Division began moving from Namkham to Mangshi under the cover of darkness, requiring 3 nights to complete the movement. Shortly thereafter, the headquarters of the 16th Regiment was called from Bamo to Mangshi, and Colonel Hara Yoshimi, commanding officer of the 2nd Reconnaissance Regiment, succeeded Colonel Sakai as commander of the Bamo Garrison, which was placed under the 18th Divisional control. On August 30th, the division conducted a war game, followed by a conference to brief subordinate commanders on the plans and the missions of the Dan operation. With the recent arrival of the 4th and 146th Regiments, Matsuyama planned to send Matsui's task force and the 146th Regiment northwestward to clear the western sector. Meanwhile, General Okazaki's 2nd Division would attack northeastwards to defeat the main enemy force in the eastern sector, thus fully relieving Long Ling. Subsequently, the 56th Division would advance towards Tong Chong, while the 2nd Division moved towards Lameng to relieve both isolated garrisons. However, before this offensive could even begin, new developments emerged from Tong Chong. Realizing that assaults on the ramparts were too costly, General Ho ordered his Chinese troops to start tunneling under the walls. Additionally, air attacks increased intensity, and on August 13th, several large bombs struck the headquarters, killing Kurashige and leaving the garrison nearly leaderless. The following morning, after a heavy artillery bombardment of about 20,000 rounds, Ho launched his second general attack. Despite the garrison's determined defense against Chinese attempts to breach or scale the ramparts, Ho reinforced his southern assault with the 198th Division, applying intense pressure. While defenders held against the combined attacks of more than 2 divisions, the 198th Division, which had made several ineffectual attacks in the northwestern sectors, was brought south to reinforce the units already there. 3 divisions pitted against the badly damaged southern wall could not be held off, and the Chinese troops began infiltrating beyond the rampart. The garrison launched counterattacks, and while they were successful in driving the enemy out on the first 2 occasions, the 3rd counterattack exhausted the defenders, so much so that the enemy held the southwest corner of the compound. The Chinese were not, however, able to make any appreciable headway in breaching any other part of the castle's defenses. 3 days later, following another heavy aerial and artillery bombardment that succeeded in making 7 breaches in the southern rampart, the Chinese resumed their offensive and managed to force the garrison to relinquish all but the southeast corner of the southern part of the castle compound. On August 22nd, a 4th attack was then launched, and in spite of valiant efforts by the defenders, the west gate of the castle was finally taken by the 198th Division early in the morning of August 24th. The following day, about 500 grenades and medical supplies were dropped by 12 Japanese fighters, which bolstered the garrison's morale, even though their fate was pretty much sealed already. Simultaneously, Matsuyama initiated Operation Dan on August 26th, with Matsui's task force struggling for 6 days to secure control of Komatsu Hill before advancing towards Shangpo on September 1st. The Dan offensive opened inauspiciously with an unsuccessful attack on Komatsu Hill, about 3 miles south of Long Ling. Launched by the 1st Battalion of the 113th Infantry, known as the Takeda Battalion, on the morning of the 26th, the attack was thrown back, and it was not until the following morning, after the 3rd Battalion of the 113th, known as the Murakami Battalion, had been thrown into an attack, that the Takeda Battalion succeeded in seizing the western half of the hill. Upon achieving the objective, the Murakami Battalion was withdrawn, and the Takeda Battalion was exposed to severe counterattacks, which the enemy repeated for 4 days. The Takeda Battalion sustained extremely heavy losses, including the loss of 3 company commanders. The Inose Battalion attacked the hill from the northeast on August 30th and succeeded in making contact with the Takeda Battalion the following day, but the northern part of the hill still remained in possession of the enemy. Unable to hold up the advance any longer, the Inose Battalion was left at Komatsu Hill to clean up the remnants of the enemy, and the main body of the Matsue column advanced to Shangpo on September 1st, fighting their way through enemy resistance. The 146th Regiment successfully bypassed Chinese forces blocking the Tianmin Road, reaching the ridge west of Shangpo. The 113th and 146th Regiments continued their northwestern advance, reaching the Long Ling River line by September 6th, where they nearly wiped out the new 39th Division. Meanwhile, Okazaki assembled his 4th, 16th, and 29th Regiments at Chongpo, preparing for an offensive. To the south, the 76th Division persisted in defending Komatsu Hill despite heavy casualties. Okazaki directed the 4th Regiment to attack the enemy's northern positions on September the 3rd, resulting in repeated assaults over the next 3 days. Despite suffering significant losses, the Japanese were compelled to halt their local offensive. In the meantime, the 16th and 29th Regiments moved northeastwards. The 29th Regiment successfully breached enemy positions and linked up with the besieged garrison by September the 6th. Despite this victory at Long Ling, subsequent events at Mount Song and Tong Chong rendered Operation Dan futile. On August 29th, following the fall of the Otobayama position, Kanemitsu realized that the resistance could only last a few more days more. On September the 5th, Major Kanemitsu sent to the commander of the 56th Division over a final radio message this: "All of my brave officers and men have determinedly defended our position for 120 days since May the 10th with sublime spirit of self-sacrifice and an attitude of absolute obedience. However, ammunition has been entirely expended, and practically every officer and man is wounded. The final moment has come. We will burn the colors and the code books and make a suicidal stand with what strength remains. I do not have the words to apologize for the fact that, because of my unresourceful command, we have been unable to hold out as long as expected. We are deeply moved by your long and special consideration of our situation. I respectfully ask that everything possible be done for the bereaved families of the officers and men of the Laang garrison. Our souls will continue to pray for the eternal prosperity of the imperial throne and final victory of Japanese forces." Consequently, on September the 5th, he concentrated his remaining forces in the northmost positions, which came under heavy enemy fire the next day. After Kanemitsu's death from a mortar shell, the Japanese burned their colors and euthanized their wounded. They launched a final suicidal charge on September the 7th, resulting in the death of the remaining 50 survivors. Of 1,260 Japanese at the Laang garrison, only 9 were captured and 10 believed to have escaped, with the rest perishing at the hands of Song's divisions, totaling approximately 41,675 troops. The significance of Mount Song lies in a 4-month siege to clear the block from the Burma Road, during which the Chinese had suffered 7,675 casualties, including around 5,000 from the 8th Army. This left it with only 2 understrength regiments fit for further combat at Long Ling. Meanwhile, on August the 31st, General Ho's 5th attack, pressed with great enthusiasm, eventually succeeded in taking the southeast corner, which had withstood the onslaught of 2 divisions for over a month. The garrison was then pressed back to a line running from the east gate through the center of the palace grounds to the northwest corner of the castle grounds. The number of survivors had been reduced to approximately 350, virtually all of whom were gravely wounded. 5 days later, the Chinese attacked once again, successfully effecting a breakthrough of the defensive line, which split the defending force into 2 groups. By September the 9th, the northwest corner had been completely overrun, and only 70 men remained to hold the northeast corner. Realizing that the end was near, the Japanese burnt their colors, and on September the 14th launched a last suicidal charge in which the remainder of the garrison was finally cut down. In a valiant defense rivaling that of the Laang garrison, the 2,025 men of the Tong Chong Garrison held off the Chinese 20th Army, numbering an estimated 50,000 troops for approximately 80 days. Despite this, the capture of Tong Chong marked a significant victory for the Y Force, as it opened a viable route to Mitkinya, known as the Tong Chong Cutoff. Moreover, the fall of Tong Chong and Laang allowed the Chinese to deploy more troops to counter the Dan offensive. In the early hours of September the 7th, the 113th and 146th Regiments crossed the Long Ling River and launched an assault against the 1st Honor Division, entrenched in strong defensive positions. Although General Matsui's battalions were repelled by determined defenders, the 146th Regiment were notable in their progress on the left, gradually pushing the Chinese forces northwards. By September the 9th, the western and northern sectors had been partially cleared, and the Long Ling garrison were nearly completely relieved. Simultaneously, the 29th Regiment, supported by remnants of the 16th Regiment and the 2nd Field Artillery Regiment, advanced northeast towards the eastern hills, encountering difficulty in capturing them. By September the 9th, they had only secured one of the hills. With Honda growing impatient due to the slow progress of the 2nd Division, Ozaki directed increased attacks in the following days. Then an attack conducted on the 12th by the 3rd Battalion 29th Infantry was successful in seizing the hill, However, a counterattack by the enemy resulted in the annihilation of the battalion and the retaking of the hill by the Chinese. Furthermore, Okaseki had also noted the Chinese were still holding their ground to the south. Consequently, orders were issued for the 1st Battalion, 16th Regiment to address this lingering threat. However, the battalion exhibited such limited initiative that Colonel Tsuji Masanobu of the 33rd Army Staff assumed direct command of the frontline units. With the addition of another battalion, this proactive commander led his troops in a series of vigorous assaults, culminating in the capture of the southern hill by September the 15th. Meanwhile, to the north, Matsuyama successfully relieved Long Ling, yet a new challenge emerged. The formidable 200th Division had just arrived from Kunming and launched an immediate attack against the 113th and the 146th Regiments by September the 9th. Fortunately, Matsuyama received reinforcements in the form of the 3rd Battalion, 148th Regiment, and the reserve 168th Regiment, effectively clearing the northern sector by September the 11th. Positioned defensively, Matsuyama's forces continued to fend off repeated counterattacks from the aggressive 200th Division, while the 168th Regiment moved westwards to confront a significant element of the 36th Division advancing south from Tong Chong. At this juncture, the Japanese had suffered approximately 1,800 killed, 2,500 wounded, while Honda estimated inflicting over 63,000 casualties since May. Despite the costly relief of Long Ling by mid-September, the 33rd Army had failed to reach the Drore River or rescue the Lamang or Tong Chong garrisons. Moreover, with Tong Chong's fall, the entire 20th Army Group was mobilizing to reinforce Chinese forces engaged in the Long Ling campaign. Realizing that Operation Dan faced inevitable failure, Honda opted to halt the offensive. Instead, he directed the 2nd Division to undertake a defensive stance south of Long Ling. Simultaneously, the 56th Division and the 168th Regiment disengaged from the enemy, moving southwards to relieve the Pingda garrison. On September the 16th, the divisions rotated smoothly. The 56th Division gathered east of Mangshu, while Colonel Yoshida Shiro's 168th Regiment initiated a covering attack to the east. This left the Long Ling garrison vulnerable, prompting its commander to defy Honda's orders and to withdraw during the night. Lieutenant Colonel Komodo's actions came as a shock to the army and the divisional headquarters, and although he later committed suicide to atone for this act, the commander and the garrison were considered to have disgraced themselves and the Japanese army. Lieutenant Colonel Nagai, a staff officer of the 56th Division, when questioned in 1959, made this following statement. The Long Ling garrison had twice before made great and courageous stands against tremendous odds. They were all exhausted by their efforts and had expected to be relieved. It is understandable that the garrison should bitterly resent being placed in a position where they might be possibly surrounded in Long Ling for a third time. The defense line of the 2nd Division was so drawn as to leave Long Ling projecting and constituting a primary target for enemy attacks. It should also be borne in mind that the garrison was not an organic unit but was instead a composite group composed of various elements without the esprit de corps of a regular unit. Although Lieutenant Colonel Komodo was a respected officer, his tendency towards a philosophical approach to life may have made it impossible for him to hold out against the unanimous discontent and the resentment of his subordinates. Fortunately, Matsui's 3rd Battalion arrived in Long Ling 2 days later without encountering Chinese forces. Despite being outnumbered, the 2nd Division managed to maintain its extended front by destabilizing the enemy and conducting nightly raids. On September the 17th, Matsui launched a successful relief operation, driving the 9th Division from the Shangjia area. Concurrently, the 146th Regiment embarked on a forced march towards Pingda. By September the 22nd, it breached the enemy lines, reaching the besieged city. Having been isolated for nearly 6 months, there were scenes of wild rejoicing as the besieged garrison welcomed the Imoka Column. Carrying about 150 casualties on stretchers, the combined forces of the Imoka Column and the Pingda garrison broke through the enemy lines at night, reaching Liang Tao Chai, where they were covered by the Matsui Column. Both units withdrew to Mangshu, and when the Yoshida force subsequently pulled back from Isawa Hill, the Pingda relief operation was concluded. Following the conclusion of the Pingda relief operation, Honda began preparations for the impending enemy offensive. Subsequently, the 56th Division was tasked again with defending Long Ling and Mangshu, while the 2nd Division relocated to Muse to prepare for a potential counterattack in the Drore River Valley. Meanwhile, the rested and reorganized 18th Division, now under Lieutenant General Nakaitaro, successfully concentrated at Namkam by the end of September. The 33rd Army expected that the main force would arrive prior to the end of the month, but the movement was executed very slowly and the units were arriving to Nam Cam throughout the month of September. Upon the arrival of the division at Nam Cam, the units continued to work on fortification construction that had started by the 2nd Division. The main body of the division moved via rail through Mandalay, while the 55th Infantry Regiment with 1 artillery battalion and 1 engineer company advanced through Katha, Kunchang, and Sikao on foot. The division was gradually built up and by the end of September had achieved a strength of about 7,000 men. Since the replacements for the most part consisted of men recently discharged from hospitals, the complete recovery of the division was understandably slow. The 18th Division finally managed to concentrate on Nam Cam by the 1st and the early part of October. On October the 2nd, when Lieutenant General Naka, who had replaced Lieutenant General Tanaka, arrived at Nam Cam, he found that the division still had not fully recovered from the effects of the Hukawang operation. However, abundant food supplies in the area, combined with excellent climate, enabled the division to make an unexpectedly rapid recovery during the month of October. By early November, the strength of the division had been built up to 9,000 men, of whom about 3,000 were reinforcements from Japan. Some tanks and 2 149mm howitzers had been supplied and 6 mountain guns repaired. During this period, the rehabilitation of the division engaged in the construction of defense positions on both sides of the Drore River in the general area of Nam Cam. This period allowed the Japanese ample time to strengthen their defenses, as Y Force had suffered significant casualties. General Wei found it necessary to retrain and reorganize his depleted divisions before resuming the offensive in Yunnan. Because of all of his immediate reserves having been drawn into the fight for Long Ling, and considering that the Chinese government had ignored his earlier pleas, General Wei Lihang asked General Dorn, Chief of Staff of the American personnel working with the Y Force, to present his further requests for 20,000 train replacements. Wei had not received one since the offensive began, for 2 more divisions, for permission to use the 5th Army's tank battalion, and for Baoshan to be deployed as a supply base. Dorn, however, was only partially successful in that the National Military Council renewed its promises to send replacements. Shifting focus from Yunnan, we now turn to operations of the 20th Bomber Command. Following the unsuccessful Yawata strike on August 20th, Saunders continued planning for the return to Anshan, initially set for August 30th but was postponed to September 8th. On August 29th, Major General Curtis LeMay assumed command of the 20th Bomber Command. Despite the change in leadership, Saunders' plan remained unchanged. They were going to deploy every serviceable B-29 aircraft. Saunders' plan was to dispatch every B-29 fit to fly, and so by September the 8th, 115 bombers had gathered in the forward area, and 108 successfully got off the runways. Of these, 95 reached Anshan to find good weather, with 90 of them dropping 206.5 tons of bombs at the Showa Works and 3 bombing other installations, while another 5 hit the Zhejiang Railroad yards and 3 others hit various targets of opportunity. Total losses for the mission were 4: a crack near Domkondi on the way up, 2 forced to land in China, 1 destroyed on the ground by enemy planes, and 1 partly salvaged. There was also a plane listed as missing. The crew of their last plane later walked out of the loss with only a man. The Americans in turn claimed 8 kills, 9 probables, and 10 damaged. The following day, a B-29 reconnaissance plane reported significant damage to the steelworks. Out of 16 coke oven batteries, 3 were estimated to be out of commission for the year, another 3 for 6 months. Additional damage to the related installations and the byproduct plant further compounded the impact. Overall, command intelligence officers calculated that 2 attacks had reduced the Showa's coking output by 35.2%, which in turn would decrease total Japanese rolled steel production by 9.3%. In response to the extensive damage, the Japanese launched their first counterattack against the 20th Bomber Command. Shortly after midnight, Japanese bombers came over Xinjiang and attacked the American headquarters, storage areas, and parked B-29s. Aided apparently by ground signals, the intruders made 4 runs, dropping fragmentation and high explosive bombs to inflict minor damage on 1 superfortress and a C-46 and to wound 2 soldiers. Meanwhile, LeMay, who had accompanied the mission to Anshan, was encouraged by the promising results. Despite this, he had been tasked with implementing significant changes to the command. He began revising tactics, tightening and expanding formations, and enhanced training for greater bombing precision, effects that would become evident in the following months. Specifically, LeMay intended to substitute for the current 4-plane diamond formation for a 12-plane formation similar to the one that he had used with his heavies in the ETO. He proposed further to follow the 8th Air Force practice by subordinating night missions, so far numbering 4 of the command's 8 strikes, to daylight precision attacks. This would not mean the abandonment of radar bombing, so vital in variable weather. LeMay's doctrine called for synchronous bombing, in which both the bombardier and the radar operator followed the bomb run-in, with visibility determined who would control the plane during the crucial seconds before release. Precision bombing required training more sustained than the sporadic sessions which the command crews had undergone. Unfortunately, new arrangements for nourishing strikes out of China would release B-29s and their crews from much of the hump transport duty, which had handicapped training. On September the 5th, LeMay had ordered each group to select 6 lead crews, later increased to 8, upon which other crews in the formation would drop. A week later, a school was set up at Dongkundi, occupied since early July by the 444th Group. Ground training and simulated mission and critique on each of the 10 successive days made the 11th day course at the Dumkandi Tech both strenuous and valuable. Meanwhile, the other crews of the 4 combat groups had been working with the 12-plane formation and had made some progress when training was interrupted for the 9th mission. Most of September was spent initiating LeMay's reforms, leaving time for only one major operation at the end of the month. Consequently, LeMay decided to finish off Anshan with another 100-plane strike. By September the 26th, he consequently had 117 B-29s forward, with 109 of them successfully getting airborne the following morning. Though takeoff had been improved since the last mission, bad weather and a cold front would see only 86 bombers reaching Anshan, 73 of them actually bombing the Showa works, and all by radar. Subsequent photographic coverage, however, indicated absolutely no damage. In addition, 2 B-29s bombed Daoren, 4 Xinjiang, and 9 bombed various targets of opportunity. Japanese opposition was likewise ineffective, with the Americans suffering no losses. Japanese opposition was likewise ineffective, but during the night, enemy bombers managed to sweep into Chengdu's area to drop 3 strings of bombs and damage 5 bombers, 2 of them seriously. The Chinese warning net had tracked the Japanese planes in from Hankao's airfields, and the 317th Fighter Control Squadron at Chengdu had ample time to alert command personnel. But the one P-47 up could not make any contact. The 312th Wing had suffered with other Chinese-based units from a lack of supplies, and in the interest of economy of fuel, one of its P-47 groups had been exchanged for the 311th Fighter Group, equipped with P-51Bs. Chennault, reluctant to tie down 2 full groups for stacked defense of Chengdu, had disposed part of the wing forward where the planes could take a more active part in the war, and events would prove that this policy constituted no serious danger to the B-29 fields. I would like to take this time to remind all of you that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube and continue to help us produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. Hey, don't forget about our sister podcast over at The Age of Conquest, The Fall and Rise of China podcast, written and narrated by me. And if after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel, over at YouTube and on all major podcast platforms. And hey, if you have a moment, why don't you check out my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/thepacificwarchannel. Over there, for as little as $2 a month, you get access to the exclusive Patreon podcast, early access to all of my content, and voting rights for what we'll tackle next. By mid-September, intense battles in the CBI theater saw Japanese forces grappling with diminishing supplies and overwhelming Chinese offensives. Despite heroic defenses at Tong Chong and Laang, Japanese positions fell after heavy casualties and strategic missteps. General Matsuyama's relief efforts at Long Ling achieved temporary success, yet the broader objectives of Operation Dan were unmet, marking a turning point in the Burma campaign.